You finished Act 5. How does this act come across within 4 different productions? I'm going to whiz you through productions from 1979, 2004, 2006 and 2019 and show how you might weave reference to these productions into an A-star essay. So stay tuned because you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
First, Desmond Davis's 1979 BBC production. The Duke's back in town, and in this production there is a significant cheering crowds to greet the returning or conquering hero, Devious Bastard, depending on your own perspective. The size of the crowd is important, and of course it is much easier to bring in a load of extras for a day's filming as opposed to a running stage production. What are the effects of a large crowd? Well, it gives the Duke more of an opportunity to play Puppet Master Supreme and send a public message about his own desires to ensure justice is done and wrongs righted. With just the key characters on stage and very few citizens, it invariably becomes more personal. And so when the Duke asks Angelo whether he has word or wit or impudence that can yet do him office, it is a more intimate question as opposed to sending a strong message to the city as a whole. Why has Angelo let him down in this way? How could he? Less so in this production, in which the Duke's return is a cause for public celebration. And sustained applause, although it is notable that within this screenshot, Aeschylus's clapping is far more enthusiastic than Angelo's. But there are other effects of the large crowd gathered to welcome the Duke home in this production. It means, for instance, that Isabella's humiliation and embarrassment are accentuated. Far more people hear that she, apparently, was coerced into sleeping with Angelo, and far more people witness the moment when she is placed under guard and, apparently, carted off to prison. Look at the shocked expression on the woman to the right of Isabella. She is clearly relishing this dramatic moment as Isabella rhetorically builds up to denounce Angelo, and one gets the sense that these juicy tidbits will be spread throughout Vienna within minutes of the scene ending. As far as we know, Isabella's current plan at this point in the play is still to join the votaries of St. Clare, a set of nuns who, once they have vowed, may not speak with men but in the presence of the prioress. But here in this production, she is not only speaking to a man, but she is speaking to a man publicly vowing loss of chastity in front of a significant crowd. For me, the presence of so many people in this production makes the Duke's games all the more despicable. Yes, we can presume that, to some extent, he's been harsh to Isabella in order to lull Angelo into a false sense of complacency, so that he can confound him more completely later on. But knowing the eyes of Vienna are upon them all, does he really need to humiliate and patronise Isabella the way he does, saying things like, "Poor soul, she speaks this in the infirmity of sense," when he himself has privately conspired with her to act in this way? The Duke's unhooding also changes slightly due to the large numbers of citizens present. It becomes more of a spectacle, something else to ooh at, murmur about, and gossip about later on. But it is also unquestionably undignified. Can any of us watching this video in 2022 imagine Queen Elizabeth II or Prince Charles putting on a similar stunt? But this perhaps fails to take account of the context in which the play was first performed. There were plenty of disguised ruler plays in the early 17th century, including Marston's The Malcontents and Middleton's The Phoenix. The king on the throne at the time of the first performance, James I, was believed to occasionally disguise himself to mingle amongst his people. Thus, within this context, a Shakespearean audience may well not have felt such grappling unseemly, and simply viewed the Duke's disguise as a perfectly acceptable means for a leader to discover more about his people, and an opportunity for some delicious drama and dramatic irony. That's all very well, but ultimately we are watching and experiencing this play in the 21st century. For me, it does seem a little ridiculous watching the Duke whipping his gown off and attempting to resume his ducal authority. But the crowd are nonplussed. Their beloved Duke is back, and that is all that matters. Hooray! Perhaps some of our reactions and feelings that the Duke seems rather too underhand and manipulative for our liking stems from contemporary attitudes towards authority. We are far quicker to challenge authority, and the concept that the king may be God's representative on earth is long, long gone. But of course, in any production of Measure for Measure, arguably the most intriguing moment in the entire play will be how Isabella responds to the Duke's marriage proposals. Well, initially she is inscrutable, although note the look of interest and kind concern on Claudio's face. However, the second reference to marriage is more successful. The Duke, after the neat, almost certainly disingenuous anti-metaboly, "What's mine is yours, and what is yours is mine," holds out his hand in invitation to Isabella. She makes him wait 8 seconds. Anxious expressions all around, tension. But then she indeed takes it with a small smile and cheers from the audience. Hooray! Now time for an exam question. The ending is much happier than the play as a whole, is it? There is certainly an argument to be made for the ending being happier than the play as a whole. As with any comedy, the muddles and confusions that have arisen throughout the course of the play are largely resolved within the final act, resulting in a degree of clarity and multiple marriages. And the middle sections of the play contain plenty of dramatic misery, including Claudio's expectation of death, his desperate confrontation with his sister, and Isabel's torment following Angelo's alarmingly acquired lust. However, the extent to which the ending is happy will clearly depend on the production and Isabella's reaction to the Duke's marriage proposals. In the 1979 BBC production, Isabella pauses and ponders for a good 8 seconds following the Duke's offer that what's mine is yours and what is yours is mine. However, she then takes the Duke's hand, smiles slightly, and cheers erupt amongst the citizens. Within this interpretation, all characters have learnt the dangers of excessiveness and the importance of convivial human relationships. By marrying the Duke, Isabella is, probably subconsciously, giving herself the opportunity to construct her own sexual identity and strip herself to life rather than death. Rather than closet herself away for the rest of her life and having to choose between hiding her face or speaking, she is opening herself up to partnership and sharing. Similarly, following the Duke's intervention, Angelo's lust has been appropriately redirected and, by implication, no longer will he consistently rebate and blunt his natural edge with profits of the mind. Even the deliciously recalcitrant Barnardine is given a new lease of life at the end and is released. What's not to like? Next, the 2004 production at the Globe, broadcast live on BBC 4. The striking feature of this production is the way the Duke, at the beginning of the act, seems to take every opportunity possible to show his support for Angelo in a physical way. We already know in the text that he voices his support for his deputy with proclamations such as, "We hear such goodness of your justice that our soul cannot but yield you forth to public thanks," and, "Oh, but your desert speaks loud." However, in this production, he actually lifts up Angelo's hand triumphantly whilst Isabella is holding forth and pleading for justice on her knees. Isabella continues to plead for justice and make allegations about Angelo. And what is the Duke doing? Continuing to publicly show his support for Angelo and not even give Isabella the common courtesy of looking at her as she is talking. He also persists in remaining on the other side of the stage to her. He even shakes a member of the audience's hand in favour of giving Isabella his attention, causing amusement from the audience and diffusing some of the tension in relation to how this abused woman may be given redress. So, how should we react to all of this? Should we simply relax and laugh, knowing that the Duke knows exactly what has happened and will soon enough get round to turning the tables on Angelo? Or do we wonder whether letting Isabella, the novice nun remember, struggle on without any help or sympathetic looks at all is needlessly cruel? With such pally, male, macho, supportive body language from the Duke, no wonder this Angelo can relax and smirk, no matter what Isabella may be alleging. Verbally and physically, the Duke is making his support for his deputy incredibly, and with hindsight suspiciously, clear. I rather like the way Mariana is presented in this act in this production. The text seems to present her as some kind of infuriatingly passive saint. She has always loved Angelo, always will do, irrespective of how idiotic and horrible he has been towards her. She is poor, permanently to be pitied, and cannot do anything for herself. Not quite so in this production, where she shows a human side and channels years of pent-up frustration into a stinging slap. Yes, her hand used to take comfort from his hand, and will, in her vision, do so again. But her hand can also show her anger for the appalling way this man has treated her. This Mariana can also use her body and self to create striking visual representations aimed at prompting redress from male figures of authority. The trouble is, of course, that the men totally ignore this striking symbol and confer between themselves at the front of the stage. Thus, Mariana's representation of a marble monument becomes a symbol of her own impotence and passivity, rather than the catalyst for either Angelo tapping into his own conscience or the Duke recognizing that his game may cause unnecessary temporary pain. At times, the Duke certainly strikes me as being brutishly insensitive, both in the text and in this production. Or is he just bloody clueless? In this production, he turns towards the audience delightedly, holds his arms aloft and smiles broadly as he suggests that with Angelo dead and Mariana in possession of his estate, she will be able to buy herself a better husband. The audience laugh and Mariana becomes desperate. And yet this is the same Duke who in Act 3, Scene 1 suggested that he knew exactly how Mariana felt about Angelo, telling Isabella that she had in her the continuance of her first affection, and that her love, far from being quenched by his unkindness, had become more violent and unruly. So as ever, we must ask ourselves, what is this Duke up to? Is he just recognising contemporary attitudes of his time, which prioritise the crucial importance of women achieving financial security ahead of romantic love? Or is he looking to toy with Angelo, make him suffer, and to hell with Mariana's feelings, with his ultimate aim making himself seem all the more the saviour when he, and only he, chooses to unravel and pardon all? As the final act reaches its conclusion, this Duke ironically seems less in control, in spite of his quick-fire pardons and judgments on all kinds of people. His voice tremors with emotion as he urges couples to be happy and love each other. He even gives Aeschylus a random hug, much to the surprise of the latter. Why is this? Well, it seems to me as though he is nervous about Isabella and whether she will be prepared to marry him. In this screenshot, the Duke has his eyes closed and his hand to his heart whilst Isabella is speaking. Is he thinking here, this is the saintly woman I love and must have? And her facial expression after the first proposal is not promising. Gaping, open-mouthed astonishment, as if to say, what the hell? Have you gone mad? Thus, this Duke doesn't risk giving Isabella time to reply to his second proposal. Instead, we move on to the traditional Globe end-of-play dance, something which all cast members take part in, and Isabella cannot turn down the Duke's arm. She has agreed to dance, but it is left ambiguous about whether she has any intention of accepting him as her husband. Time for another one of my sample paragraphs, this time whether many of the play's outcomes are obviously unjust. The suggestion that many of the play's outcomes seems obviously unjust strikes me as somewhat unfair and inaccurate. Barnardine has been in prison for a whopping 9 years within an appalling no man's land as he continually waits to find out whether the state will manage to persevere with his execution. Many audience members will feel that enough is enough and that this gloriously intractable individual deserves better times to come. Meanwhile, Angelo has been forced to marry Mariana, someone with whom he has consummated his relationship and someone who has loved him for years. Again, most audience members will feel that, over time, this relationship has the potential to develop, especially given the violent and unruly nature of Mariana's feelings and passion for Angelo. Claudio's death sentence has been rescinded, and he has simply been urged to restore that you wronged. Given that Juliet early confirmed that their sex sessions were mutually committed and that she loves him, there is no reason to suppose that their relationship will not flourish, especially given the narrowness of Claudio's escape. In the Globe production from 2004, Juliet enters the stage with their baby. The pair embrace and seem blissfully happy. However, the one outcome which will always provoke ferocious debate relates to Isabella and her relationship with the Duke. Does her textual silence indicate, especially for a modern audience, coercion? Certainly, his unravelling of Claudio and his first marriage proposal within a certain sentence disturbs. If he be like your brother, for his sake is he pardoned, and for your lovely sake give me your hand. It is almost as though it is tit for tat, a measure for a measure. The saving of Claudio in exchange for a life of bondage to a highly manipulative, albeit rich and wealthy man. Returning to the 2004 Globe production, Isabella certainly looks dumbstruck the first time the Duke suggests marriage. And at this point, there is no doubt that the audience will feel a burning sense of injustice if they conclude that Isabella, a trainee nun, lest we forget, will have no choice but to accept this man as a husband. But this is left deliberately ambiguous. Next, 2006, film version of the play, directed by Bob Komar. Firstly, Act 5, Scene 1 starts on a much smaller scale. There is not the same crowd or celebratory air as the 1979 production, or the same elaborate formality as the 2004 Globe version. So this means that the encounters become less about public showing off or public declarations about justice, and more about the dynamics between the characters. To some extent, this may be due to the change in setting. From an entire city of Vienna in Shakespeare's original, at least in theory. In practice, it is Shakespeare's London, but with the change in location to prevent accusations of slander, to a British army base. Any judgments and precedents will only impact upon the lives and careers of a relatively small number, as opposed to a city or a full society. In addition, looking on from the outside, do many of us not consider army communities to be slightly different anyway? Not just far more regimented, but also with more extremes within relationships, i.e. you might get friends for life, but is there not also the potential for some terrible bullying? Indeed, when we think about the main plot devices of Measure for Measure, how surprising do we feel it would be for a man with authority to try to procure sex in an unsavoury way within the stereotypically macho, intense, claustrophobic confines of an army base? Other moments of interest in this production include some rather creepy stroking of Isabella's face by the Duke, as he both simultaneously suggests that Isabella must be mad, but nonetheless seems to be talking with some logical reasoning. As ever with this production, there are hints of unnecessary displays of violence. Here we see a guard branding a baton towards Isabella's neck following the Duke's abrupt, and curious in any production, demand for her to be carted off to prison. To my mind, the use of unnecessary violence by guards and officers in the film as a whole seems to point to a kind of desperate paranoia in relation to control. The army base has been in such a state of disorder that excessive violence for the few disciplined for their crimes may be employed as a pathetic, impotent attempt to send a message to the majority. However, there are some strange moments in the final act of this production, partly due to the fact that so much of the play has been cut, and here the role of Aeschylus enormously watered down. It is Angelo, not Aeschylus, who gets in a rage with Friar Lodowick, following his suggestion that the Duke was unjust to reject Isabella and Mariana's appeals for justice, and put the accused person, i.e. Angelo, in charge of judging his own case. So it seems as though Angelo is referring to himself in the third person as this worthy man, which doesn't quite work. However, this change does ensure that the focus remains unequivocally on Angelo as the villain, Angelo as the bad guy. Indeed, given Aeschylus has said so little in the film so far, it would be strange to have him, or her in this production, suddenly getting enraged and commanding here. One change I rather like, however, is the method by which the Duke's real identity is exposed. When changing to his disguise as Friar Lodowick moments previously, the Duke decided to keep on his ring, perhaps a signet ring, or at least a ring signifying his ducal authority. Whilst furiously ordering for Friar Lodowick to be sent to prison, Angelo suddenly spots the friar's hand, and it dawns on him that this man must be the Duke, causing his breathing to quicken and for him to fall to the floor. Thus there is no unseemly grappling as in other productions and arguably the original text. Instead, the Duke calmly removes his blind man sunglasses, and the Provost, his confirmed ally from Act 4, remember, when the Duke revealed his true identity to him, helpfully takes off his wig. The result of this change is a far smoother, more dignified transition to power for the Duke. There is no need for jaunty whipping off monks' robes to reveal inner finery. Indeed, it is notable that the Duke keeps on his Friar Lodowick dog collar for the remainder of the play, and here, as he demands whether Angelo may have some kind of possible defence for what has happened, knowing that he doesn't. The effect of this is to give the Duke additional gravitas. Helpful, perhaps, given his past history, and emphasises the Jacobean view, which was that Duke or King would have been a Christian figure, someone expected to uphold Christian values such as virtue, honour and grace. I'm not so sure that all contemporary audience members would have necessarily believed in the divine right of kings. However, they would have accepted him as head of the church and state, with responsibility for the spiritual well-being of his people. And so in this production, the Duke retaining his dog collar ensures that he comes closer to the broader definition of a duke or a king, i.e. there is a spiritual and religious component as well as a practical leadership role than would typically be expected from the head of an army unit. But what are the moments you have all been waiting for? How does Isabella respond to the Duke's marriage proposals? Well, what is notable here is the rough way the Duke first grabs Isabella's arm to show her the returned Claudio, and then continues to hold on to it to ask whether she will give him her hand and she will be his. Unsurprisingly enough, she brushes him off in irritation, doesn't take any notice of his nonsense, and goes up to emotionally embrace Claudio. And the second proposal, in which the Duke declares that what's mine is yours and what is yours is mine? Well, Isabella gives Claudio a final kiss before walking purposefully off into the distance. She may not speak, but the message is unequivocal. There is no way on earth she would be marrying this devious, manipulative, sly prick, whatever his position and authority. Cue tense faces, tense music. Even Mariana looks incredibly miserable, in spite of the fact that she is now married to the man of her dreams. Even more pertinently, the directors cut the attempted face-saving final rhyming couplet of the play, meaning that the play ends categorically with the Duke's isolated failure. No celebratory air, no dancing as at the Globe, just tension. Have the Duke's machinations all been for nothing? Exam question. Is the conclusion of the play, like the play as a whole, full of uncomfortable moral choices? There is no doubt that uncomfortable moral choices abound within the final act of the play. Is the Duke acting morally when he pardons Barnardine, forces Lucio and Angelo to marry Kate Keepdown and Mariana, and himself proposes to Isabella? Barnardine has been described unequivocally as a murderer, not deserving a jot of the provost pity. Should he really be quit from his past crimes with no further consequences at all? The forced marriages, although logical in their way, also make for slightly uncomfortable viewing, albeit tinged with comedy in some productions. Should a supreme leader be able to publicly impose upon the domestic sphere in this way? With both relationships, one senses that harmonious married life will not be easy to come by, particularly given some of the language used by the men to disparage their now wives. Angelo, presumably outrageously, talked of Mariana's reputation being disvalued in levity, whilst Lucio repeatedly called Kate Keepdown a prostitute and claimed that being married to her would be akin to pressing to death, whipping and hanging. And what of the Duke's proposal to Isabella, the same person he twice referred to as daughter and apparently destined to be a nun? Such a proposal seems, particularly to modern audiences, a gross abuse of power. Not only is he putting implicit pressure on her to accept due to his position as head of state, but he has also managed to worm his way into her affections through his disguise as a friar. As a trainee nun, she would have trusted such a figure unquestionably. In the 2006 Bob Komar production, the Duke even seems to put physical pressure on Isabella to accept his proposal by roughly clinging onto her arm whilst pointing to Claudio's miraculous reappearance as apparent justification for her accepting his offer. The fact that she walks away immediately after the second proposal confirms her feelings of enormous discomfort at what has just occurred. Now, the RSC 2019 production. Could be argued that to some extent Lucio steals the show in this final act, and certainly his appearances in this production provided plenty of laughs for the live audience. For the opening minutes, he is positioned on a balcony at the back of the stage and holds forth from there. In this scene, he cannot resist intervening and interjecting, whatever the occasion. He loves the sound of his voice too much, and its effect on others. Never mind that he is annoying the hell out of the Duke, he's getting laughs and holding forth on his stage. Even when busted and in a perilous state after unhooding Friar Lodowick and discovering the Duke, he still manages to provoke laughs. Here he daintily produces a handkerchief before meticulously positioning it on the floor to ensure his trousers don't get dirty when kneeling to ask for the Duke's pardon. This man is a dandy and will stay a dandy, even when on the verge of being sentenced to a gruesome death. This director increases the focus on Lucio in the scene by once again bringing Kate Keepdown on stage as he did in Act 3. Remember that Kate is only mentioned in the original text, but including her on stage in this production confirms categorically what some of the effects can be of unchecked male sexual activity, and also provides comedy in the splendid contrast between Lucio's dapper gentleman's attire and Kate's lurid prostitute wares. Note the hands on hips here from Kate. One senses that when the pair are left together and married, Lucio may find himself at the receiving end of some well-deserved verbal and probably physical blows. Barnardine, of course, gets a few laughs when he enters the stage to be unexpectedly pardoned. Here you can see him laughing heartily, not at being pardoned, but actually beforehand when the Duke tells him that he is condemned. Here is a character who doesn't change throughout the play and is straightforward to understand. He is simply someone who scorns authority and actually rather enjoys his comparatively utterly limited existence. And what are the proposals from the Duke? Well, with the first one, there is the quick look of utter incredulity from Isabella in the midst of a relieved, passionate hug with Claudio. For the second proposal, the Duke waits for some time with his hand aloft, hoping that she might take it, but probably knowing in his heart of hearts that she will not. The stage is cleared, with the others heading off to the palace. The spotlight is on the two of them. The last moment of the film production of the play shows a close-up of Isabella, her head twisted upwards in abject misery. Do we sense that there will be coercion, and even though the very idea is hateful, she will need to marry this man against her will? For a play that ends happily, Measure for Measure has a lot to say about death. Do you agree? Depending on the production, one might argue that a more accurate statement about the play could be this. For a play that ends unhappily, Measure for Measure doesn't have a great deal to say about death. For instance, how happy is the ending? There are at least 2 forced marriages. Lucio and Angelo are forced to marry women they have openly vilified. And then there is the relationship between the Duke and Isabella. In the Globe's RSC 2019 production, there is no question that Isabella is enormously unhappy about receiving the Duke's proposals. The final moment of the play sees a close-up of her in half darkness, head twisted to one side in abject misery. Such a reaction is unsurprising, of course, given that she now knows the Duke deceived her about virtually everything, including his status as a friar, and most unnecessarily of all, about the death of her brother. She was also publicly humiliated by him whilst pleading for justice against Angelo, with at one point the Duke calling her a fond wretch, mad as I believe no other, and calling for her to be sent to prison. It is very difficult to describe a potential relationship between the two as a happy ending, notwithstanding the fact that in Jacobean times the opportunities for any woman to become a king or duke's wife would be seen as life-changingly desirable. As for the references to death, it is notable that within the final scene all of the death sentences are rescinded. So yes, there are some initial flurries and concerns following the Duke's dramatic sentencing, Angelo dies for Claudio's death, but ultimately the end of the play seems to see a return for life as it was at the beginning, albeit with some stark warnings for those who impregnate. Vienna can return to being a place of lax governance, where liberty is generally free to pluck justice by the nose.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, taking you through 4 different interpretations of Measure for Measure and helping